Hey everybody, How To Tech bringing you the reassembly of a OnePlus X. I took a short break off of January, but now we're back and getting ready for phone season. So the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is insert the charge port back into the bottom portion of this phone. You want to insert the charge port down and into the little connector. You may have to wiggle it to fit it back into place. Make sure that the screw holes line up and that the vibration module is going to sit back inside of its little housing, making sure that the antenna connector isn't pushed underneath of the cable. Let's pull up this tape just a little bit to make sure we get it in there nice and flush. Make sure it's adhered properly. Now we can go ahead and push the antenna cable connector back onto the bottom of the board here. Just going to try to get it to line up properly. Side down the housing. Now, one thing that makes this really difficult on the reassembly of this phone is this little plastic housing that runs all the way around the phone. And this actually prevents a lot of things from fitting back in properly when you're reassembling the phone. Everything must be underneath this plastic piece. You don't want anything on top of it. That's going to cause the rear glass back to want to come off once you adhere it back to the frame. So keep that in mind as you're reassembling the entire phone. Everything must be underneath this little plastic frame that surrounds the phone. Just pushing this ribbon cable or antenna cable connector back into its housing here. Now we can go ahead and put the extender cable for the display back in place. And it's easy to line up as it has kind of the little cutouts, the white line showing where the cable should fit. You may have to pull it up a little bit when you go to reinstall the motherboard. Take our motherboard. You want to make sure you attach this rear cable first. It's a little bit easier to do, have a little extra play. Just try to make sure all the other cables are out of the way. Make it a little bit easier on you. I'm going to go ahead and take this cable, wrap it around, and then reattach it and just snap it back in like a button. You'll feel it kind of click back into place. Now with that done, we can go ahead and put the board kind of into its slot here. Now it may be easier to actually put the left side in and then the right side, but there's two posts that'll have to fit back in. One's to the right of the 3.5mm headphone jack. You'll see it kind of pop through, and then one's to the left of the camera cutout there. So we'll have to squeeze this back in. Now this part is actually fairly tricky. There's a little latch that this needs to connect into, and it seemed fairly difficult to get it to snap back in. I actually had to use a lot more force than I thought I was going to need to push this back in. Sorry, my bulbous head's getting in the way there. So using a pair of tweezers and just pushing right here on the corner to get it to snap back in. So be very careful with that. We'll go ahead and reattach the remaining ribbon cables to the board, making sure that they line up. And you also want to make sure that they're at a 90-degree angle as close as possible to the board. So when you put the battery back in, it all fits back in together properly and not putting any strain on those cables. With all those cables reconnected for the power button and the display, we can go ahead and put the antenna cable in. And this can be a little bit tricky here also. There's not a lot of space to work with. I ended up using a spudger to kind of push it, get it lined up. You don't want to put a ton of force on these. You don't want to bend them when reattaching them. So be careful when doing so. Once you get it where you want it, you can kind of use your fingernails to kind of press it back into place. Be a little tricky. And yes, I could have cut all of this out to show you it just being snapped back in, but I'd rather show you kind of the frustrations that go along with fixing the phone so you can make that decision whether or not it's something that you want to do. Now we can go ahead and just line this cable back up with its guide slot and put the tape back in down the side here to cover that up. Alright, all those cables are now reattached. The next step is to put in the two screws, one down here for the charge port cable assembly, and one right up here for the motherboard assembly. Let's go ahead and put the housing down here at the bottom. Now this is also slightly tricky. You want to make sure that this gets underneath the plastic. And that can be a little hard to do. That has a little bit of a pull out where it doesn't necessarily want to sit back in. You may have to kind of push it and slide it upwards to fit it back in properly. You'll see that all the screw holes are lined up, and that'll be kind of your indicator that everything's put back into place correctly. Now with that done, we're going to go ahead and put in the remaining screws in the bottom of the phone here. Now it can be a little bit tricky to put these screws in, and I find it easiest to put them on the tip of the screwdriver, insert them into the slot, and then screw them down. We want them to be snug. Don't over tighten them. We don't want them to be stripped out. They have a little bit of a locking goo on them that'll kind of keep them in place once they're screwed in. So don't put a ton of force on them. If you need to remove them, you want to be able to get them out. Put in the 4 top screws here. Last one down for this bottom housing. Now with that done, we can go ahead and insert the battery into the phone. We also have inserted the camera. Make sure you put that in also at this point before you put this rear housing back in. It also just snaps back in place. Taking the housing, we can go ahead and lay it down. It doesn't really have a hard time fitting around the plastic, but we want to make sure it's flush and underneath it as much as possible. We'll go ahead and put the screws in the top housing portion of the phone. One last screw to go. Everything's nice and snug. Now the next step is to go ahead and remove all of this gunk around the outside of the phone. This excess glue or tape, whatever's here. And you want to clean off anything that might cause it not to get a good seal when we reapply the double-sided tape to the back side of this phone. So you want to take your time and clean this up as much as possible. This step will save you hassle of having to do it later when the back wants to come back off. You can clean it enough. I'm going to do the same thing to the back piece of the glass. Clean off any adhesive that might be remaining on it. So when we lay down the new adhesive, we get a good solid seal on the phone itself. Now we will be using just some 3M double-sided tape. You can see we have our back piece of glass here that's nice and clean and free of adhesive. And really we're just going to put long strips all the way around the phone, just running it down the side as close to the edge as possible, so overlapping the plastic frame and then onto the housing portions of the phone, peeling it back. And then you do want to shape kind of the corners of the phone if possible to get as much adhesion in those corners as possible so you get a solid sill. And the end result should look something like this, with the tape on top of the two housing portions. It's cut to fit all the way around the outside of the phone. Now we're just going to go ahead and peel the backing off. Now, one last thing that I would suggest that you do, and you probably should do before you even get to this stage, is fire the phone up and make sure everything's going to function properly before you. Make sure that everything's reattached, the display is going to boot up, your Wi-Fi is going to work, your Bluetooth's going to work, before you go through and re-adhere the back onto the phone. That way if you do need to disassemble it and change something, you can do so without having to go through all of that hassle again. So we've got it all peeled up. I did cut some tape to fit right above the camera portion here as well. Next step is to go ahead and take the back glass and lay it onto the phone. Now the easiest way to do this is start with one corner, line it up so it's nice and fit, and then work on the opposite corner. Once you get the top of the phone working, do the bottom of the phone, make sure that they're in tight, and then work your way around the sides of the phone. That way you don't have any issues with the glass not fitting and cracking the back glass when you put a lot of pressure on it to get it to seal. We'll go ahead and just power the phone on here real quick. You can already see the display is going to function properly for us. We'll test the touch here in just a few seconds. Go ahead and put our SIM card slot back in here and give it a few seconds to boot. Alright, and there you have it, the reassembly of the OnePlus X. If you have any questions, hit me up. You want to see future disassembly reviews, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one. Peace.